Okay, welcome to this little demonstration on how to produce both a histogram and a frequency polygon. I've kind of put them together in this one plot here on Excel, so this is sort of our objective, if you want to think of it that way. Now, before we begin, it might be useful to talk a little bit about the data set itself. You can see it's got distribution of stock returns from my growth portfolio as the heading here. So it's a let's just say there's some portfolio one has of a certain number of stocks, and their returns have been calculated for a given year, and then we're plotting their returns on this histogram here. Those of you familiar with Excel would know that it does not do histograms particularly well. That's the blue bars. So I'm going to start this demonstration in another program called STATCRUNCH, which I think does a better job of doing histograms. So here I've got STATCRUNCH. I've got a listing of the stock code and the stock returns here. So these are percentage returns for each stock. You can see 29%, 33%. They're quite large because they're growth stocks, right? Now I'm going to put a copy of this data set up in the description of this video. So feel free to play around with it yourself. But it's just one I've manipulated from some data I gathered from another source. There are 300 stocks. 200 of them are growth stocks, and 100 of them are classified as value stocks. So in StatCrunch, I'm going to go to where it says graph, and this is how easy it is in StatCrunch. I'm going to click on histogram, and then here I'm going to select which column I want to use for my histogram. And of course, I'm going to use stock returns percentage, not the actual stock code, obviously. The other option that we get here in StatCrunch is this group by option. Now we know there are both growth and value stocks in here, so I might just select type of stock to group these histograms by. So this just means that I'm going to get several histograms, one for each type of stock I have in my data. Of course, I only have two types of stock, growth and value at this point. So I'll get 2 histograms. And let's just add a couple of markers here for the mean and the median. And let's just see what happens. I'm going to click compute. So straight away, you can see that it produces a histogram for you. The best bits of this is that the bins, you can see at the bottom here, that you've got categories that start from, say, 0 and go up to 5% returns, then 5 to 10, 10 to 15. Which are very logical start and end points of these bins. Now, if you hover over a certain bar in this histogram, you'll see it says the exact frequency, which is 94. So there are 94 stocks, and you can see this is for type of stock growth. So 94 growth stocks that have returns between 10 and 15%. And if you're very, very observant here, you'll notice that there is where it says 10 and 15, there's a hard bracket next to the 10, meaning that 10 is included in that column. And there's a soft bracket next to the 15, meaning that 15 is excluded. So a stock return of 14.999% will still be in this column, but a stock return of 15.00000% will be in the next column. So we can click over here in the bottom right to the type of stock equals value. So this is the histogram here for the value stocks, and you can see that we have certainly lower returns. I might just toggle between these two plots. So here is the growth stocks, where a lot of them occur between 10 and 15% returns. And here are the stock returns for the value stocks. And you can see that a lot of them are a bit less than 10%. But then again, we also have less down the bottom here in the negative returns as well. Okay, now the other thing we can do using StatCrunch is not only produce a frequency histogram, but we can produce a relative frequency histogram. So if we change the type here to relative frequency, and I'm selecting my columns stock returns and grouping by type of stock, and I click compute, you can see we actually get the same plots as we did before. However, you can see that the relative frequency here is on the y-axis. Now you can read these as proportions. So for example, between 10 and 15, we have more than 40% or 0.4 of the distribution. So that's really useful if we're going to toggle between the growth and value stocks. We'll get a good sense of what proportion of the stock is between each of those particular brackets. And this is called a relative frequency histogram as opposed to just a frequency histogram. So this is what we're aiming to achieve in Excel. Now you'll notice that in a proper histogram, you identify the upper and lower bounds of each of the bins. So here 10 is identified as the barrier between those two bins or classes. Unfortunately, Excel's not going to be able to do that. So we're going to have to do our best in Excel. It's still possible to create something like this, but we're going to have to play around a little bit. So let's go over to Excel and see what we can do to create for ourselves a histogram. Right. So here's our data. Same exact data, but I've just put it into Excel. The first thing we can do is just see what the basic histogram function does in Excel. So if I was to highlight all of my stock returns, so all of those returns in that second column, highlight them all. If I go to insert and one of these charts here, you can go recommended charts. In fact, I might just click that so we get a sense of all the possible charts we can do. I'm going to go to all charts here. So these are all the possible charts we can do for this stock return. And one of them will say histogram. So if we click on that and go OK, I mean, it kind of gets there, but you can see that clearly the bins or the classes where we're going to categorize all of the observations are not very well put together. So we're going to have to edit those. If you really want to do it this way, you can double click on that. So it opens up a format axis panel over here. So what we could do is we could artificially change the bin width. You can see one of these options here says bin width. Now if I select that and choose say 5, that could help out a little bit. You can see that's changed our little chart already. And the other thing we can do, if I bring that back, is change the overflow bin, which just basically means the lowest and highest bin that we want. Because the maximum is 33, if I click that overflow bin here and set it to 35 and select the underflow bin and make sure that's selected to -10, we've almost done it. We've now set the bins so that their width is 5%, which is quite handy and easy to see, but you can see there's so many decimal places here. So what we can also do is go down to number and change the decimal places to 0. So with an appropriate chart title, which might be, distribution of stock returns or something like that, you might have something that approaches an okay histogram. Of course, these show you the bin widths down here, but they're not as well marked, and I think it's just a problem with the way that Excel puts together axes. They can't actually put the axis values on the barriers between the two bins. So this will tell you, for example, that this bin goes from 5 to 10, but unfortunately, you might notice a difference here between this and StatCrunch. The lower bounds are the soft bounds on Excel, which actually goes against convention. A value of 5.0 here would actually lie in this column, not this column, because this says specifically exclude 5. This goes from 5 to 10, but exclude 5. So again, another reason why Excel's probably not the best to do histograms. Nonetheless, we're going to press on. In fact, I'm going to get rid of this because I want to show you how to do it in a way where you can do a frequency polygon as well. So with the aim of doing a frequency polygon, I'm going to get both of these happening at once. Okay. Now, here's the fun bit. If we're going to do a frequency polygon, we need to create our own manual bins. And this is, again, a feature of Excel. So I'm going to do a set of bins here. And knowing that the minimum stock return is -10.5, my lowest bin I'm going to put at, let's go -7.5. The next bin along, I'm going to go -2.5, then 2.5, 7.5, 12.5. Now, as I'm doing this, you might be thinking, what are you doing? Why are you doing 0.5s all the way along here? For the moment, I'm going to get you just to follow me, and then I'll explain why I've chosen to do this. It wasn't necessary. I could have chosen bins that were whole numbers like 5, 10, 15, etc. But we have to appreciate that Excel has a very peculiar way of dealing with bins. When this says a bin value of minus 7.5, that doesn't mean that that's the center of that bin. It actually means it's the upper bound of that bin. So any values, any stock returns that are negative 7.5% or less will go in that bin. Any stock returns that are between negative 2.5% and negative 7.5% will go in this bin. So these are the upper bounds of the bins. So my upper, I'm going to have to put a 37.5 in here. Now the reason why I'm doing this is that I actually really want to put in another column here called midpoint. So if you appreciate that this bin has a maximum value of negative 7.5 and goes down to, let's say, negative 12.5, if we're keeping with this 5-unit bin width, then the midpoint is going to be minus 10. And I'm going to just input this manually. Sorry, minus 10. So with this bin, it's going to be minus 5. With this bin, it'll be 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. Okay, so you can see this is getting tiring already. Now, I'm going to use the histogram function in data analysis to try to populate this in terms of the frequencies within each of these bins. So how many stock returns lie in this bin? How many stock returns lie in this bin? Well, the way I'm going to do it is by using the histogram function. So I'm going to go to data and data analysis. Now, if your computer doesn't have data analysis on it, then you might have to add it in. If it doesn't exist in the data ribbon, you're going to have to go to File, Options, Add-ins, go to Manage Excel Add-ins, and make sure that you've checked that box that says Analysis Tool Pack. And once that's there, you'll notice that you've got data analysis available here. So if I click on data analysis, I'll go to histogram. What I can do now, it'll allow me to select an input range, which of course is going to be the stock returns, which I'll highlight here. That whole column. I'm then going to select the bin range, which is going to be this bin range here. And notice that when I selected those two fields, those two arrays, I included the labels. I included what was written in that top cell there. So I'm going to make sure that I have this box labels checked. That tells Excel that the very first item in these arrays is actually text, not numbers to put into our plot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest an output range, which I'm going to click to be here right next to where it says bin. And I'm going to click OK. And what that's done for me is it's basically provided for me a frequency of how many stocks lie within this bin. Now, keep reminding yourself what this bin is. This first bin represents stocks that have returns between minus 7.5 and minus 12.5%. This one is between minus 2.5 and minus 7.5. So again, these are always the upper bounds of the bins. So the midpoints of the bins are here. So basically, I'm going to try to create a graph that will have the midpoints and the frequencies jotted down in the same plot. So if I want to do a histogram now, I can select the frequency column, and then if I go to where it says column graph, I can select a column graph. So I might just click on that to see what the default is, and it goes frequency. And so that looks okay, but there's a few things I need to effect here. The first is that my x-axis is not appropriate. So I'm going to have to tell it that it's not just an index between 1 and 10. These midpoints are going to be what's written on this axis here. So if I go to this plot and go right-click, select data, I can select here the horizontal axis labels. And here if I go edit, I'll be able to select a label range, which if I select this, unfortunately it's hidden behind this frequency plot. I might just move this guy out of the way. Get out of the way, mate. Let's move it. Let's try that again. Select data, horizontal axis labels. I'm going to select these midpoints. Click OK. Click OK. So here we have close enough to a histogram. If you want to make it a bit better, you can click on these and make sure that the gap width goes down to 0. And the series overlap we can also put down to 0 as well. That'll probably help. So if you go to this paint bucket tool, this will deal with the colors, the fill and the line. The fill is obviously the blue bit. The line would be a border around the blue bit, which is maybe something we could consider. So let's put a solid line in there. Done. Looks pretty good. So that's probably the best you're going to get in Excel. The numbers represent the midpoints, and if you wanted to fiddle around with this a little bit more, you could add tick marks to this axis here. And so I've gone minor type, I've put them to go across the axis, and then for some reason the axis is white. I don't know why that is. Let's just make the line black. There we go, looks a bit nicer. Okay, so that's the histogram. Let's see if we can do a frequency polygon with the same data. So I'm going to select the midpoint column and the frequency column. And I've done that by holding down the control key. I don't want the bin column involved in this. And if I go to a scatter plot, you'll see there are some options here where I can choose a scatter plot that has straight lines and markers, and that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to click on that. And so here we have what is a frequency polygon displaying the distribution of my stock returns. So some things we might want to fix up. Let's just move this down a bit. Come on, buddy. Move it around. Come on, Excel. Here we go. Here we go. So something we might want to fix up. This axis is right in the middle. So again, if you click on this in Excel, you'll get this panel which will allow you to format various elements of it. And it's just a case of playing around with it to figure out what you can do for that axis. So I didn't actually know how to put this where I wanted it to, which is all the way over to the left here. So if you go to where it says axis options up here, you can go down to where it says labels, and the label position you can choose to be high, low, or next to axis. If you choose low, it'll put that axis on the left-hand side, which is a bit nicer for mine. I like it over there. So you can change the colors of this if you'd like, but I don't mind it as it is. This for me is a decent frequency polygon. Each of these numbers are nice round numbers, 0, 5, 10, 15. And that's really thanks to me putting those awkward bin bounds, the upper and lower bounds of each of the bins. Remember, I had to make them 7.5 and 2.5, etc. Because in doing so, the bounds of each of these is going to be, say, negative 2.5 and positive 2.5, but the midpoint will be 0, and so we'll get this nice frequency polygon coming out. And the other thing you can do, if you go right-click and go change chart type, you can do other things like do an area plot as well. So let's see what happens if you do area. So that's pretty cool. Let's try that. Yeah, maybe that's a little bit too tricky, and it probably loses a lot of distinction in terms of being able to see what's going on. So ignore that. Let's do it. Let's leave this as it is. Now the final little stroke of genius, if you want to follow me here, is to put them both on the same plot, which you can do. It just takes a little bit of playing around. So feel free to watch me do this. I'm going to include another column that's called frequency, because basically we've got two plots we're going to put on the same graph, and they're going to actually contain the same data. We're going to do a histogram using this frequency variable, and we're going to do another frequency polygon using the same data. So let's see what happens. I'm going to select the midpoint. I'm going to select this frequency column, and I'm going to select that frequency column. I'm holding control as I do this. And then I'm going to go insert and see what happens if I go create combo chart. Okay, didn't quite figure it out. That's okay. We'll see what happens. I'm going to go the first default value for that combo chart, And then I'm going to play around with it. So I'm going to drag this down again if Excel wants to help me. Let's go, let's go, let's go. So the first thing I want to do, you can see that that blue series here is the midpoint. It's actually included the midpoint as part of the series here, which is not something I wanted to do. So let's get rid of that. If I just click on that series and press delete, it'll eliminate it. And you've noticed already that it's kind of almost provided us with what we wanted. It's given us a bar chart and a frequency polygon. Why you'd want to put them on the same graph, I don't know. You can make things kind of look cool if you want to by doing it like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is fix the x-axis, and so I need to actually select the data to do that. If I right-click and go select data, there's the horizontal category axis labels which I need to change. So it's not from 1 to 10. I'll have to go edit and change it to the midpoints, minus 10 to 35. I'll then go OK. Now that should be okay. I don't think we need to do it for both of these series. I think if I just click OK, we'll be all right. And yes, it indeed appears that we're okay here. So if we want to, we can then fatten up these lines, fatten up these bars so they look like a histogram and not a bar chart. We might want to change the colors because who wants green and red? That's a bit gross. So I'm going to go back here to where it says color, the fill and line. And for fill, I'm going to make it blue. Nice. And for this series, I can click on that series and change the color of that as well. So for the line, I'm going to change that from green. We might make that red. Why not? So here we've got a histogram plus the frequency polygon. And you can see now the relationship between the two as well. So a frequency polygon should be touching the tops of each of the columns of your histogram. Now, all that you really need to do now is change to a nice fancy title, which is Distribution of Stock Returns. And if you really wanted to, you could start getting a little fancy here. We don't need to have this legend down here. We can get rid of that. We can add an axis label by adding chart element, axis title, vertical. We can call that frequency. And horizontal here, we can call that return. We can call that yearly return. So if we click on there and go add a little border, just to make things a little nice, come on, there we go. So there we go. We have a histogram and a frequency polygon. And one final thing, while I've got you here, I've just thought of it. Let's see if we can do a cumulative frequency polygon. So this is a frequency polygon, which will give us the frequency at each midpoint. What if we're trying to find a cumulative frequency polygon? Well, for that, we're going to need a cumulative frequency column here, frequency column. Now, I'm not sure why my fingers are not typing, but here we go. Good. Cumulative frequency. Now, we know what a cumulative frequency is. It's basically the sum of all the frequencies that are at that bin and before it. So, for example, the cumulative frequency at the end for this final bin is going to be the sum of everything before it. So I can do here a function called equals sum, which will sum up all of those values. And if I close that and press enter, we can see that there are 300 stocks in total here, which is great. Now, if I go into the formula bar here, this is a bit cheeky. I'm going to lock in the first cell reference for this summation formula. And in doing so, when I drag this formula up, you'll see that this cell reference, the start of the array, will stay stationary, but the end of the array will change depending on where it's dragged to. So if I click enter and drag that up, that'll calculate for me the cumulative frequency for each class. And if I click, so say in this one that says 138, and I click in the formula bar, you can see it's referencing the sum of all of those together, which is exactly what I wanted. And the reason why I could just drag that upwards was because I've locked in that first cell. Great. So now we have a cumulative frequency series. So I'm going to select the midpoint series and the cumulative frequency series, again holding down the control key. And if I go insert, and I can do again, that scatter plot with straight lines and markers is probably your best bet. So I'm going to drag this down again. So what's happening here is that it always goes upwards. So it's a cumulative frequency polygon. Again, if I wanted to, I could change this so that that axis is in the right spot. Change the heading so that we can say cumulative frequency polygon for stock returns in my portfolio. And you can fix that up just like the other plots. So the more you play around with Excel, the more you'll find that there are things you can do. To make things look a little bit nicer. So if I sort of, click in the background here, I can change the fill of the background and make it a gradient fill, so it looks kind of cool. Fiddle around with some of these options here. Oh, there you go. That doesn't look cheesy at all. So this is not for an academic journal, but you can see that you can edit this quite a deal now in the more recent versions of Excel. They've really started to make it easy for you to edit the chart so that you can't tell it's come from Excel, which is very useful. So I'll give you a download of this completed worksheet in the description of the video below. But that's it. That's graphing numerical data.